preamble about feed. So we are a series of fireside chats, even though in Singapore there are no firesides, but never mind the irony, on technology, ventures, creativity, and topics of really personal interest for me and my co-founder Dominic, who couldn't be here tonight as well. So please do chime in tonight in the chat with your questions, and also at some point if you'd like to during that when we open up to the floor, if you would also like to just unmute and dialogue with us, that would be really welcome as well. So I think just introducing our speakers, and again, Aaron is on his way, very busy man. I think it would be good to set some context of why the topic of designing for resilience, and essentially how this tonight came about. With huge thanks for Randy and Aaron, who will be here shortly, for joining us. So the reason for this session came about when Aaron and I earlier this year were talking about digital government, which he's doing a PhD on. But fast forward a couple of weeks, I was introduced to Randy, and thought that it would be really interesting to put at cross points kind of the perspective of a career civil servant, together with a design veteran who is heading the design organization of 100 strong, also multidisciplinary designers for what is ultimately, I guess, Southeast Asia's most successful super app. Can we go on the table and say that? And that it would be interesting to think about resilience from the standpoint of everyone having taken a beating this year. I mean, you're all behind your Zooms, and both governments, companies, organizations have all had to figure out a way to plow ahead with uncertainty. And so we would love to plumb the depths of both your perspectives tonight, and if you could shed some light on in both your roles as leaders and stewards in your organizations, and also in your personal trajectories, what the sources of resilience are that you found in both your organizations and just the worlds in which you operate. So I think without further ado, I think maybe I'll just give a quick introduction of Randy, and you can do some sharing, and then when Aaron gets here, we'll do a quick introduction of him, and then he'll do some sharing, and then we'll all participate in the dialogue. So, so Randy, thank you so much for joining us. So yes, as was written in kind of the invitation, Randy, you've both founded a design studio, built some of the world's most successful two-sided or multi-sided marketplaces, which ultimately have given people jobs, sources of income, like Etsy. I mean, that kind of uplifted a whole generation of DIY home businesses, as well as now you've moved to Singapore to work at Grab for 2 years now, and in taking a bigger perspective of your role, it's also about the potential to uplift 600 million lives across 8 countries in Southeast Asia. I mean, that's just massive opportunity right there. So thank you for joining us tonight, and I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on sources of resilience that you found in managing a large organization that serves a greater body, and that is distributed ultimately across very different geographies. And Southeast Asia is not monolithic, and you operate at different scales in Grab as well. Hello. So yes, we have our other distinguished guest, Aaron. Well, also, I mean,
hello,
yeah, hello everybody.
welcome.
Yes,
Perfect.
yeah. So yeah, really two very busy men here tonight. Randy actually had just come from some events at Design Singapore, and Aaron has just literally come from serving at the speaking at the Rotary Club International. So thank you both for serving the community and the audience.
Doing our best. Thank you. Don't keep you waiting. Thank you for waiting.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, so Randy is going to share some thoughts, and then I'll introduce you, and then we'll start.
Yeah, sure. So, I think that maybe I'll just speak at I'm creating the architecture for this as I say it. So I was going to say 2 layers, maybe it's 3 layers, but perhaps the most important layer when we think about the source of resiliency has really been at the very personal and human level. And I think I can speak to it at some larger like system ways, we think about it in a business or marketplace. But I think something that became clear very quickly was our ability to, in some ways, respect the responsibility we had as an organization for this massive number of customers, but really get in a mindset quickly of the kind of put your own mask on first. So I think very quickly, I think people inside of our organization, we felt the gravity of the challenge and the problem. And because maybe the opportunity is so big, that creates a massive sense of responsibility, and that can become almost can feel impossible and can be demoralizing or have this intense sort of like emotional state, emotional effect. So at a really personal level, I think for us, even though it seems counterintuitive, you want to serve the customer and serve the audience, was very, very quickly realizing that we needed to kind of serve each other, be there for one another in order to be able to have the capacity to then serve in the bigger ways that we wanted to. And I think that was maybe an important quick lesson. And then maybe is also like an ongoing lesson in a way, because I think there seems to be this ebb and flow that is happening. There's like kind of a collective ebb and flow of what the experiences felt like, throughout 2020, of feeling comfortable and feeling challenged, feeling, like you can lean in versus feeling exhausted, feeling like you can handle another like tragic world event, or like you're inspired to help people and you see their own like resilience. And so kind of acknowledging that there's big waves of that we experience. Like coming from the States, I experienced a wave of it around the American election, in a very like intense way. But then also at these really intimate personal levels, people have their own personal health challenges, their family, people who are used to traveling to see family. So having to be sensitive to all these unique circumstances as well as the collective ones was like really lesson number one. And being, I think, flexible at a really personal level of the kind of like, you don't have the capacity to show up today the way you normally do, and that's okay. Really like getting it kind of that basic. Then at the more system level, I think it has been about giving ourselves permission to let go of maybe convention in some ways about what we ought to do, what we should do, how we've committed to this plan. We've said this is what we're going to accomplish this quarter. If we don't do it, I'm not going to be able to kind of show that I followed through on the thing I said we're going to do, and to just create the space to say, hey, it's okay. Like, what should we actually do, this week to respond to the circumstances, to help our customers on the ground, or help, other circumstances.
Yeah.
And if those don't align with the plans we committed to 3 weeks ago, so what? Like, we'll come back around and figure that out.
Yeah.
But some stuff becomes much more existential, and you're like, let's take that survival lens first, and think about how it ends up connecting back to maybe the larger strategic plan later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like going back to startup roots.
It is, and I would say that, if I were to be very specific then to our organization, well, maybe there's two things I could identify as strengths. One is that this kind of on the ground, quick response spirit of the whole organization. It's something that I didn't experience as it grew. I mean, I stepped into it once it was kind of mature, but it is a point of pride and a point of emphasis in the internal company culture. And I think to see that still exists is something that the whole organization was able to leverage. It's like we've done this before. We can do this. Using kind of past examples to energize people to make new progress in that way. And then the other is, I think, just the massive scale we're at and the variety of businesses we're in, able to see what a kind of a broad portfolio means in the context of like kind of massive change that you can't control, but your business is flexible in many ways. We have so many different offerings and so many different markets for different parts of the for different segments of customers. Some of those things were hit really hard in negative ways. Some of those things had demands that created massive business growth in other ways. And that seeing a diverse portfolio play
Yeah.
out like in real time very quickly
Yeah.
is a real point of
Yeah.
strength.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Classic the upsides of diversification.
Yes. Yeah.
But so much to go deeper on there, and I'd love to also get some examples from you later. But also then to turn to Aaron. So introduction of our lovely Aaron here. You wear many hats.
A small head.
Right. And as a career civil servant, currently Deputy Secretary at MCI, and interfaith community builder. You founded Birthday Collective, which we'll hear a bit about on later, and you're a poet, which is actually the original way in which I understand you in my life as a when we were a creative arts program,
Right.
when I was a mere like teenager, and
Hi, so sorry to jump in, but several people have have commented that Wendy was a bit soft. So perhaps you guys can go in a bit nearer to the mic
Yeah,
when
okay.
you're
Yeah.
speaking.
Sure.
So sorry for interrupting. Please go
No,
on.
thank you, and thank you everyone for giving us that feedback. Is this a little better?
Yeah, I think later on, just maybe get closer to the mic when you guys go into like your panel. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. So Aaron, and finally in your long CV, one of the things you've been doing lately is dedicated your lives to a PhD on
Yes.
digital government,
Yes.
which is
A
related.
foolhardy error. No, it was not. It was
So,
not.
yeah.
I
So
enjoyed it.
soon we will be calling you doctor, hopefully, fingers crossed. And also found the time to host a CNA program on chasing scarcity, asking the question of is scarcity even real? So those are some of the many hats. But Aaron, I was wondering if we could open with you sharing some observations on Singapore as a resilient system, or even government as a resilient system, given the response and what you're seeing on the front lines, but also how we've managed to keep together, even as the pandemic might have exposed inequalities and fault lines along society.
Yeah, that's a big question, Chan, but a really worthwhile one. And the way I would start with it is to say that, I mean, there's been a lot of things that we have done, I think, and that have been reasonably successful, right? We're at a place now where our death rate is still very low in terms of response to the pandemic, but we've also had a huge number of cases, particularly in the foreign worker dormitories. And I think those are interesting extreme points to start with, right? And ask ourselves, what do they indicate about success, and what do they indicate about also the areas that we need to do a lot better on? And the thing I would start by saying is that, you know, we've got a system that has very strong fundamentals in a lot of ways. It's a system where, you know, there is a strong, rigorous response on public health. And the fact that we've managed over time to actually contain the caseload, to get community cases down to a very reasonable number now, I think has been helpful. But we are also, and those are the ways in which we are resilient, but we are also not totally resilient because we're a small open economy. Right? The reality of what we are is that we have to be open to the world, and we can't, unless we decide we want to become a fortress, we have to stay open, or at least reopen ourselves now that the bulk of our circuit breaker is over. We have to open up again. That's what we're seeing in terms of air travel being resumed. It's what we're seeing in terms of, you know, Singaporeans from elsewhere in the world coming back home. And in that case, there will always be, I think, a certain number of imported cases. So the real question that I think we have to ask, right, is not just to look at kind of pure quantifiable metrics like the number of cases. We need to ask ourselves, what are the indicators of the overall quality and strength of our system? And I think part of that comes from looking at the death rate, like I said, because that indicates both the response that we have in the public health system, as well as the kind of rigor that exists in things like testing and contact tracing, and also the overall social compact that exists amongst people, where we realize that actually the things I do affect you, and the things that you guys do will affect me, right? And that we're all kind of in this together. That, I think, is one sign of a resilient system. And it's something that we I think would have to emphasize a lot more as we go along. I thought I'd end with just one very quick idea around, you know, if we are going back to fundamentals, right, then I kind of reduced my experience of the pandemic to what I like to call the A, B, C, and D, right, of that whole experience. And so that it doesn't get more fundamental than that, right? The first 4 letters of the alphabet. The A is about addictions, right? And I think all societies in the world have had to ask themselves, what are the things we were addicted to before that we've now realized we are addicted to, and that we need to therefore wean ourselves off from? And one of those things, I think, is the assumption that physicality matters. I mean, we're interacting now. You guys are giving us feedback. I don't think that much has been lost in that process, although it is nice to be here with Randy and Yishan, right? So the assumption of physicality, I think, is an addiction that we can move away from. Assumptions about growth and scale, I think we need to address as well. Maybe size isn't everything, right? Maybe the quantifiable stuff out there isn't everything. And we need to move, I think, beyond that addiction to realize that there are other indicators of value, that there are other ways to measure the quality of an experience and the happiness of a people, not just in things like growth, although that is a necessary, I guess, but insufficient indicator. So that's the A. The B is for blind spots, right? What are the things that we've missed before? And again, I think this is, in a lot of ways, a golden opportunity to ask ourselves, what are the things that we didn't see before that could make us more resilient as a system? And I think one of the biggest blind spots out there is mental health as an issue, right? I think we've all realized in societies across the world that we have not given enough attention to mental health because people are under more stress now, more sustained stress than they've ever been. And we therefore need to find ways for that to get noticed, for that to be legitimated as part of the human experience, and for it to be something that people can seek help for without being stigmatized, or seek treatment for without being stigmatized, because it is part of their experience, right, in this very difficult time that we're all in. That's the A and the B. The C is for cracks, and I think the biggest crack that we've seen in all of our pandemic responses in the world has been that the effects are felt deeply unequally, right? Some people deal with much larger cracks than some others. And the inequality of that, I think, is something we really have to grapple with. The fact is, the most vulnerable people are the ones who've been most at risk, right? One of the Catholic schools in Singapore likes to call the last, the lost, and the least, right? They are the ones who are most affected by this outbreak. And I think we need to realize that and not try to have cookie cutter or one size fits all approaches in terms of the solutions that we put out there. And that's part of resilience too, right? Not assuming that this kind of mass production is always going to work for everybody. And then the D stands for dysfunctions, right? What are the dysfunctions that we have learned about the systems that we believed in before? And in part of that, I think, is about realizing that, markets are useful, but they're not everything. Capitalism has brought some benefits to some people, but it isn't everything. And we need to realize that there are dark sides and dysfunctions to that system as well. And the sooner we realize that and find ways to ameliorate that, right, through redistributive politics, through ways in which we can cater to the welfare of a much larger group of people, the sooner I think we will realize that actually the dysfunctions can be dealt with, but they will take very deliberate action, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of how collectively communities respond as well. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Aaron, for that exposition. And I want to then seg into a question around corporations as positive players in the ecosystem. So Randy, so Grab has the potential, and also for the benefit of those who couldn't quite hear us clearly earlier. So Grab has the potential to reach and uplift 600 million lives across 8 countries in Southeast Asia. And how do you see the role of the 100-strong design organization? And also, as I see that a good percentage of people attending are actually designers of different disciplines. How do you see the role of the design strong organization in enabling the impact across the diverse business lines? And how do you set up daily ways of working or even team culture to achieve the outcomes, as you said, putting your mask on first?
Yeah, sure. If I'm not loud enough, just send the message. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. The opposite of a thumbs up, whichever that is. Yeah. When we think about here's a very simple answer, but I think it is also the best one, which is the role of the designers in an organization. Or it doesn't have to be designers. I think in our organization it is, and in many it is, but to take a real sense of responsibility as a voice for an advocate for the customer or the user, right? Which sounds so simple and obvious if you come from a human-centered design practice, training, or a lot of the conventions that we think of as common in a design practice today. For many like working design professionals, but not necessarily everyone. And it's also easy to say, easy to learn in an academic context, easy to write down in a set of principles, and pretty easy to believe in. So as a designer, you're like, oh, we're the advocates for the user. Like I can wake up every day and feel, proud of that. Like I'm work on behalf of someone else. More challenging to put in practice regularly, but still probably the single best point of leverage for the answer to your question, right? Which is, how do we think about design enabling that? So there's a great deal of then careful and thoughtful, and sometimes disruptive and divergent kind of problem solving and sort of invention methods that come later, and kind of downstream from that. But I think number one is having a clear sense of a purpose and responsibility about working on behalf of that end user, the customer. That's I think the single most important. Because if we miss that, and sometimes we do, it's easy to let it slip from your grip sometimes, or to not quite have the right information at the right time to feel like you're the advocating as clearly and precisely as maybe you need to. But if we miss that, the other things then start to get a little loose, and you have to kind of collect them back together and help them make sense for the user again. And so then I think, it kind of has a hierarchy of things that need to happen. There's sort of awareness, so you bring awareness of the user, and that can kind of happen in various rings of influence, let's say, local at like almost a project team level, more broadly at an organizational level, and spaces in between. And so that really starts to look like, communication design, and kind of the distribution of messages, things like that. And then it looks like creating the experiences for other people to connect with those users or examples of those users that kind of bond them to that responsibility as well, right? So we come in as an advocate or to hold the story out in the perspective of the user and put them at the center of the process. And then, so you kind of tell people about this, right? You make them aware of things. And then the next thing to do is connect people with that experience themselves, so they become holders of that also. And so we think of sort of design, in particular, the human-centered and research, methods, we think of design as like the point of the spear. So we're going to start the conversation and take responsibility to be the advocate for the user, but not to be the only advocate of the user, right? The point is to try to almost like spread the religion, as kind of quickly and deeply as possible.
And you mentioned at the kind of project cell level, how else does this play out at Grab in terms of making it pervasive across the organization? I mean, I've attended sessions where your CEO, Anthony, talks about kind of the 3 H's, like I think heart and honor and something.
Humility, hunger, yes, there's 4.
4 H's. I mean, how else is this human-centeredness, which is the spear to make sure that design creates an outsized impact on both product excellence, serving communities, actually creating value to customers. What are some of the organization-wide practices, rituals, language, culture that celebrates this?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll speak to just 2 that sit at kind of different extremes of the spectrum. So one is kind of an operationally heavy, high participation version, which has been heavily reduced because of the nature of travel and other things, which is running deep immersions, right? Where people join the organization and very quickly, as part of their own onboarding into the organization, go on the ground and like deliver food, like really live out the full experience. There you're interacting with different sides of the marketplace, even the supply and demand side, like very quickly. And then the research practice inside design was like a scaled operational version of that. We would send about like 40 people into market and basically run observational research with other team members from around the organization, exposes them to the research methodology, they gain empathy for the design practice along the way. But most importantly, we're engaging them with like real customer problems on the ground. They're feeling the rain, the sweat, the sunlight, the inside of people's homes, really experience that. So we operationalize that in a way, but it's very high touch.
Yeah.
At the other end of the extreme would be take some things like a very kind of a multi-data source view of what's happening with customers. And it just recently to kind of create almost diffuse awareness, like oxygen. Right? We created a Slack channel.
Oh, yeah.
That the entire organization is invited to, that pushes daily, one daily, the sort of almost like the voice of the customer of the day insight, right? So every day you get this little injection, and it comes from different perspectives. It could be like really positive feedback that's verbatim. It could be connected to some particular other customer metrics and things like that. Once a day, and I think it's actually the specifics of them can become important for people I might connect with some more than others, but it's actually the habit and the ritual of this once daily. Now it's part of the beat for anyone in the organization, and it's a reason to remember, and it's a reason to then explore more.
Is it a human or a bot that is doing that?
It's a bot.
Also a wonderful human application of bots. So thank you for that. Aaron, I want to do a bit of a crossover episode here with Gov Insider. Where you had a recent interview, which is available online if you guys search, which is to ask you a question around, can governments create super apps? You made a point around government services acting more like SaaS products. And how might those extensive platforms allow us to collaborate more intensely with citizens, engage them, deliver services in a more widespread way, or even respond to crises like the one that we faced recently?
I would start on that exactly where Randy left off, because I think it's all about what users need, right? What do citizens need? What do businesses as stakeholders need? And if what they need is for government to do this convening work of gathering the ecosystem, then by all means the government should create a super app. In fact, I wouldn't even say it should create. I'd say the government needs to be the super app, right? Government needs to be the platform. I think you can kind of think of many different metaphors for what governments do. So this is where the poetry comes in, right? Because I think poetic thinking is so critical.
I thought ABCD was already there, showing your mastery of it.
No, those are just the rudiments of the alphabet, right? So let's do metaphors now, right? What metaphors can exist for government? I mean, you could think of government as a control tower, right? In the airports, the control towers tell you exactly where to fly, where not to fly. They are the only source of correct and accurate and comprehensive information. And there was a time when that's what governments did, right? They provided order, they provided regulation, because they were the ones with superior information, and they therefore used that to create public value. Now, I don't think that works anymore because the world is far too complex, right? And there are just many sources of information. And there's much more contestation of that information as well. So I don't think the control tower metaphor entirely works. Then there are governments out there that try to be vending machines, right? You put money into them, as a good taxpayer does, and then you get something out of it. Usually a soda, right? Or some piece of candy that is not very good for you, because very often we want things that are not good for us.
GST voucher.
Well, I don't know if that comes out of a vending machine necessarily, but yes, right? That sense of government provides because you asked. And that again applies to some things, but not for everything. And I think that for me, the most compelling metaphor today of what government can do is that government can be a platform, right? Government can be the equivalent to individuals of what the iPhone is to all of us, right? This gathering of apps, right? Not just a single super app by itself. And I think when government is that, if it is that ecosystem within which all the things that we need and want are gathered, that I think is where government can genuinely start responding to the individual needs that you just talked about, Randy. Because I do think that's where we need to start. It's all about where those needs lie and what is most useful for people. And this isn't about pandering, right? Because sometimes those needs may not be what people want, right? When we do things like compulsory savings or through things like the Central Provident Fund, we may not all like that, but it is useful because the later self actually values it more than the current self does. Ask any individual male in Singapore whether they want to be soldiers in a conscript army, and they'll probably say no, because individually you'd rather go to university. But when you understand what the system needs, then actually what is good for you and your family and the protection that you're trying to afford to it is actually to have a set of policies like that. So I think user centricity is a very useful principle, as long as we remember that sometimes users don't always know what they want. And
Yeah.
then, what we need to do is facilitate, right, the ecosystem to reveal that information, right? Be curious anthropologists and ethnographers who can kind of suss out that information rather than assume that it's all there sitting pretty in someone's mind. Because often preference revelation is not a rational process. It's about going through experiences yourself and then realizing what is your pain point versus what is your joy point, and then finding a good balance between them.
Yeah. No, I think you've also just raised one of the design choices that we've made as a country that are, well, CPF basically,
Right.
that are intended at providing kind of long-term individual resilience.
Right.
So I want to direct the next question back at you actually,
Okay.
but wearing another hat, which is as opposed to kind of the institutional broad view, to actually think about resilience from a ground level point of view in your role as a community builder with both interfaith work and what you're doing with the collective. So basically, how do you seed and foster some of the communities that you do, and in the way you do, you run unconferences where there's no one kind of central voice or organizing principle. Why do you do all this work, and how do you sort of scale the desired behaviors and like allow these communities to organically self-organize, but then also therefore provide some kind of glue that because I think that is what you're doing, to provide some kind of connective tissue for country.
You created connections that I didn't always see actually in all the work that I'm doing. So this is great. If I had to pick the one or two things, it still actually goes back to users, but not just the users we're trying to cater to, but the members of that community as users as well, right? Because I think the fundamental philosophy in user centricity is that you're interested in the human, right? The human out there and their needs and wants and preferences. And when I put together any community, what I'm always asking myself is, how do I help these people who are volunteering with me? And they're often volunteer communities, right? As you mentioned, to thrive, right? And part of that starts by asking them, what gets you on fire? What do you want to do that you are so utterly passionate about that you will do it without me paying you, right? With the birthday book, as you mentioned, it's a collection of essays that some friends and I have published since 2016. And the fun thing about it is the theme changes every year. So the first year was, what is Singapore's next big thing? This year, 2020, was seeing clearly as a theme, because who could resist the pun that will never come again, right, in all of the history of humanity. So this year was seeing clearly. And each year, the number of writers increases by 1, because it matches Singapore's age. So we had 51 in 2016, and then 52, and so on and so forth. And the funny thing is, we asked people to write for us, right? 800 to 1,000 words. You wrote in 2019, right, Shan?
And Melissa, right? If I'm not wrong. Or no,
maybe.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that people don't ask to get paid, right? We just tell them, would you write this? Write on anything you want in relation to this theme, but make your voice come and sing in this essay. And we'll put you in that space, right? And then we'll distribute the book, we'll organize events around it. And people do it because it's giving a voice to their deepest desires and the thing that makes them sing. And so it's the same thing with our volunteers. All the volunteers in the Birthday Collective, which is the group that runs and publishes the book, everybody does stuff that they like. Some of them want to edit books, so we let them do that. Others have come along to us and said, I want to create podcasts out of your book. I want to create a workbook version of your essays, right? I want to create learning activities that kids can use in school and that teachers can use with kids. And then others have come along and said, I want to do videos and interview your writers and go deeper with them than the 1,000-word essay has allowed them to go. Other people have come along and said, you've done an adult book, we want to create a junior book for kids. And the answer is always, yes, let's do it, why not? Because if you are interested and passionate about it, and we recognize that your whole person, right, not just your brain, but your heart and your hand are going to get involved in this, then that will drive the project. So this kind of all boils down to the fact that with all the communities, actually, what we're trying to do is create a brain, a heart, and a hand trust. That's what the Birthday Collective says it does. But actually, I think that applies to any community that you want to put together. You've got to engage people's minds because you're doing things that they find interesting, but you're engaging them emotively and empathetically as well. So that's where the heart comes in. And you're engaging their hands, right? Their affective side, the action-oriented side of it. And when you put all those together, you get this really potent combination because people stay when they are being motivated and their sense of purpose is being fulfilled. And I find that one of the most powerful things. It's why, we have this utterly decentralized, system. We have no chairperson, president, executive, or whatever. We have someone who's designated to manage finances. There's a group of us who are like chief nags, and we call ourselves the pivot because the stuff tends to pivot around us, right? But the pivot is just that. We periodically WhatsApp people, we text them, but we don't force them to do anything they don't want to do. They just come back and the energy keeps them going.
That just sounds like a beautiful system.
I think it is.
Going back to intrinsics.
Yeah.
So then actually, Randy, as a design leader of your organization and in the previous ones that you've had before, different cultural contexts, how do you empower design decisions locally when ultimately, you have distributed geography of different teams on the ground in different parts of Southeast Asia? Oh yes, thank you. And where product teams, they tend to solve for distinct interests, or even distinct business interests. So how do you empower design decisions to enable the overall Grab product to be coherent, and or kind of sing the same tune, as it were? And can you share some techniques and practices for that?
Yes. I think so. So I think maybe I'll try to like quickly bust a myth or something, or assert a point of view that is, I have to repeat this many times actually internally with our own teams, which is that consistency or coherence sort of only matters as much as it serves the end goal. And that, I'll often say this right after advocating really hard for something like the consistency. How can we create a system so we just make the same, decision once and it applies everywhere? There's no need to make all these, customized decisions. Look at the burden that creates for us in maintenance and the overhead in understanding our product, how we communicate it differently. I'll make all this strong, point and say, but if breaking those conventions actually serves the purpose better, then maybe it's okay to break those conventions. So I think there's this interesting like tension or balance there. And I think that's a really, really important one. And so what matters more than, I think, let's say in our context, Grab, right? And the Grab maybe app experience for a general consumer. What matters more than that being coherent from Grab's point of view is that a particular customer has a coherent experience that makes sense to them. So I think that the extent to which maybe we try to do something that says is Grab's experience in Vietnam, like Grab's experience in Thailand, that doesn't really matter so much. Now, it does matter from an operational standpoint. Like at some point, if we can do things kind of conveniently and efficiently ourselves as an organization and still serve them well, then that is helpful because it means we're not wasting time and energy, not doing that. But if you imagine the person in Ho Chi Minh who's using the product, it matters not to them at all what anyone's experience of that product or service or in any other market is. It does not matter to them that it's being made by largely a team that is perhaps outside of their own market. So that's a really important kind of flip of this that says maybe the consistency isn't so important at the macro system level. It matters in the heart and mind. And actually, I think it relates to a lot of the same kind of principles of like when we think about branding at a really high level. Actually, when you see the brands that are operate at a large scale, but that people still connect with emotionally, it's more because they feel like they make sense. It's not because everything's the same. Because in fact, if things at that scale were the same so frequently, they would become inhuman and boring. Right? And so there's this organicness in them once they reach like a certain point. So then how do we do that kind of in the day-to-day work? And I think there's actually just sort of these tensions are almost like checks and balances in the system that I think if you were to ask a person today who is trying to get a product or a feature or design out to a customer, they might see them as frustrating because to your point, their focus might be on the project at the moment or solving this particular problem. But I think of them as it's a feature, not a bug in the system, that actually there's a lot of agency for business leaders and other sort of functions in the market to have strong inputs about whether or not something is available or released to the customers in that market. So even when we sort of develop things centrally, the choice at which the choice of whether they reach a customer and how and when and how that is positioned is largely controlled in the local markets. So you need then this sort of multi-point feedback loop. You go down to the ground and do research with customers in the market. You get input from the teams in the market. We come back and we develop things. But then as those things go back out, they kind of have to pass through that same thing again. And there's an informal, I would say, almost like veto power, right? Which, you know, if you're in this like centralized group, you'd be like, that's so frustrating. All these people can stop the progress. And again, I think that's actually okay. That's a healthy tension so that it does not become this just this broadcast machine. That tension, I think, is really actually healthy in the long term.
It sounds very porous, the process, and two-way.
It is,
right? In terms of development.
If you try to view it only from a sort of operational efficiency standpoint, it will like lose. You know what I mean? You will not score highly, because that doesn't look like an efficient system in the same way. But I think if you look at the quality, it's hard to know for sure, but you know, you take some leap of faith. The quality of the long-term results over time from operating that way, I believe it's better.
How so?
Because I think it achieves over time building trust as opposed to eroding trust. Because you're not in this sort of like the large, powerful, well-capitalized machine that wants to like make new and push out new stuff. Can't just do that like with its own. It has its own built-in thing to like check that inertia. You know?
Checks and balances almost.
You know, I wonder if some of what you're describing, right, is partly about, you know, again, how do we understand the ecosystem that we're dealing with? I say ecosystem for a reason. I don't think it's a mechanistic system, right? Because it's live and there's humanness in it. So it is an ecosystem. But what kind of ecosystem is it? Is this, you know, tropical rainforest type of ecosystem, which is lush and vibrant, but fundamentally really untidy as well, right? You don't find out where it starts and ends. There's all sorts of stuff going on there. There's the dark stuff under the moss, and then there's the treetops, and there's a huge variety going on. So you could have that kind of ecosystem, or you could have Japanese bonsai kind of ecosystems, which are highly structured and ultimately extremely engineered, but will not have some of that spontaneity and that sparkle that comes from a more free system. And then you could have stuff that's kind of in between. And I guess one thing I am trying to figure out is each ecosystem I'm in, which of those do I want? There's a place for the Japanese bonsai, there's a place for the tropical rainforest, and there's probably a place for some kind of semi-manicured but still somewhat spontaneous garden in between. And I think figuring out where we want to be is one of the fundamental aims of most ecosystems.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say that, you know, maybe it actually feels obvious now it's about to come out of my mouth. I think many people in the design profession start and want to stay in a certain part of the spectrum you're describing. And often it is the like bonsai end of that. You know, there's a sense of control and certainty and kind of rightness that you want to, you know, you want to create clarity out of the chaos. So you want to simplify the complex because that is perceived as a positive thing. But I think that maybe as a design practice matures, and even as like design professionals, you know, mature, the things that attracted you to the space are not the same things that make you stay maybe engaged with it over time. And that you often then tend to back out of that more pure view over time. And so where this becomes interesting, if we think about, you know, this connects with age and talent in an interesting way as well. So if you think about like a talent pool that's just like young and has lots of youthful energy but less depth in the space, you may find some gravity around a tendency, They're attracted to a space for particular attributes of it. And what you may need is to try to cultivate that maturity so that you're not trying to maybe impose the order of a design system, but instead, you know, see a design system as a thing that responds to chaos.
Yeah.
I
think that metaphor also is very fertile given that we are in the tropics. And there's some truth to that. I would love to take some questions from the floor. So do start, and we'll open up the chat in a second, just to see what you guys are kind of feeding back to us and what you're curious about. But also just to give you guys time, to both of you, if you could design the organization of the future, say 2030, what would that look like? how would it operate, and what are the choices we need to make today in order to make it so. And then I'll just open up the chat. Oh, yes, we've plenty of questions.
Okay, I'll go really quickly, which I would say, this is a very kind of idealized version, right? Which is, I think we'd have like optimized more towards highly mutable sort of generalists. And that means maybe almost a cultural acceptance of, or rejection in a way of linear progression, even from a career standpoint or professional standpoint, because the combination, the kind of organic colliding of things is more likely to create the kind of adaptability and mutability that we would need in the future. Right. And the linear pursuit of singular interests is just less compatible with that, Yeah. So then the choices you need to make, I think, are really kind of, they're cultural or societal about changing the emphasis of what success and progress and health, what do I associate with pride? What do I associate with guilt? What do I associate with things at a deep level, and end up informing those choices? And I think that in my mind, the ideal organization is, it's fuzzy. It's got lots of like blurry edges, and it kind of, in certain instances, has clarity in order to accomplish something, and kind of diffuses. Again, it's very like dynamic in that way. Yeah. And I think largely education systems and other systems of like reward or something, especially when they're at scale, it's just hard for them to, historically they've not been that way, and so it's hard for them to change.
Yeah, and through education and when we enter employment, do you think we're addicted to linearity?
I think the system suggests it. There's really simple mechanisms. I don't mean this all to be about like incentives, but you start and you like work your way up, and you kind of make progress in this way. And I think there's not a system for understanding or valuing a different way of almost like living a life that says, I can have an interest and then go have another interest, and neither of those can materialize into expertise, and I still lived a good life.
It's okay to be okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to have well, the other thing is if you guys have read a book called The 100-Year Life, the point is that we will have multiple cycles, multiple careers, and even flip the linearity of learning and working multiple times, and that includes you, the audience. Aaron, organization of the future.
Yeah, so definitely user centricity, because I don't want to go back to that because we've rehearsed a lot of that already. I would say two more things. One is space to learn. I think we're really good at designing organizations to be structured and predictable and stable and efficient, but I don't think we're always as good at designing space for people to learn. And what I mean by that is, we're increasingly getting to points in time where there's so much newness in the world that we've got to figure out how to sometimes just be, right, and watch and let the universe tell us what is going on, like get data from the world. And that's learning, right? I don't think we create spaces where learning is as easy to do. And when it does happen, it tends to be very formalized, very training based, right? Go to a workshop, fill out a survey after that. Nothing wrong with those things, but there are so many other ways we can learn. Like we can learn through games, we can learn through simulation, we learn through doing as well. And I just think that any organization that sets aside more time, kind of white space for reflection and consolidation of that learning, that for me is going to be really quite critical.
What is crowding out that space?
I think this kind of fetish of doing, the fact that we want to have action, or at most planning for action, and anything else is seen as unproductive or frivolous. We need to realize that the other stuff is not frivolous. Sometimes doing nothing is important because fields need fallow time, so do we, right? And fallow time is partly where you replenish and revitalize, and sometimes learning time is also where we can replenish and revitalize ourselves. And sometimes in learning how to do something new, we find we actually learn about our work and then the core stuff that we are doing as well. So I think we need space much more for learning. The other thing, and this is me being unabashedly idealist, right? Like I want this to happen. It may not be easy, but I think it needs to happen more. Is I think we've got a really strong language of exchange in our economy, where we understand that things must have worth or value, and so I give you money, you give me something in return, or you give me money and I give you something in return. Sometimes that is time, sometimes that's a service, but that's not the only way in which humans have exchanged stuff, right? Some of the ancient tribes exchanged gifts, not or rather they found a language for gift economies rather than exchange economies. And a gift is unconditional. I mean, you don't offer to pay a friend if they want to take you to a treat, right? You don't offer to pay your parents. At least most of us, I think, don't. Right? You don't want your child to pay you either if you take care of them. And so there are relationships that are based fundamentally on gifting. And they're not just people to people relationships. They're also about the relationship we have with our world, right? I mean, there are tribes out there that will take from the world and then give back, right? They bury their waste, they compost, they find ways for this kind of circular cycle to work. And I would love for more of our organizations to have a vocabulary of gifting where appropriate, and not just a vocabulary of exchange, because I think that's part of where resilience comes from as well, right? If we only do exchange, then that's a really brittle, transactional organization to have. When you do favors to others without asking for what's in return, right? The gift pays itself forward and it has momentum rather than it being a two-way kind of finite relationship. So yeah, learning and gifts.
Let's then go around the room to look at some of your chat, and we're all like peering to look at my tiny screen. So I think Suzanne, you seem to have more of a comment than a question, but do let us know if you have a question around that. You can come off of mute. Around Singapore being more expressive and also society becoming more polarized. But maybe we'll take, Lawrence, your question around how is the merger with Gojek going to affect your approach from a design point of view. I will qualify that the merger with Gojek has not, I mean, it's always been something that the press talks about every so often. So I think maybe we'll reframe that question to retrospectively merging with Uber, or even just the organization having taken different forms during or spun off new business units, used different partners, and just seen variability in the course of your last 2 years, and how that has approached kind of design's impact on the organization.
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe quickly, the sort of PR rumor mill is like its own interesting machine, that serves like very
self-fulfilling.
Yeah, that serves very different parties' purposes in different ways. And I think what is interesting, it's not different from looking at the financial performance of listed companies when you work inside those companies. Actually, there has to be some level of detachment from those things, because to operate in response to a news cycle when you're operating like a very concrete business with like on the ground implications is pretty unproductive. It's okay to be aware of, but not to respond to. That's just important thematically, and that's sits around our business maybe just because it's profile and its scale in a bunch of ways. The variety of forms, I think, is an interesting one that really comes back to the idea of resiliency. And as we've sort of expanded across the region and serve customers in different ways, we've started some venture programs where we're fully funding or co-investing in small entities, which plays a bunch of interesting things. You kind of feed the startup ecosystem. You might have kind of like something along the lines of first right of refusal for like future things. You may have sort of the ability to integrate those businesses in the ecosystem should they prove to be viable. So that's an interesting way to think about seeding things in this dynamic way. They can also sort of exist outside of your brand in a way. So you create some cognitive distance between what you're doing and what this other thing is, maybe until it lands, if you know it works or not, you might like fold it in. And then also we have a number of parts of our business that are like joint ventures. So our health business, Grab Health in Indonesia is a joint venture with Ping An, the Chinese health insurance company. And that's those are really important sort of strategic partnerships, these joint ventures, where both organizations are bringing different things to the table. And so that creates a level of dynamic possibilities as well. There's not kind of one format.
What is the impact on design?
The impact on design looks largely about where do you choose to take some of the organizational systems and some of the then like software or product systems and make those available in a way. How much do you extend those out or not? What operationally makes sense, because you may be able to make it easier to make things, and that can be like a benefit to some things that we're working And other times you may choose to actively let it be on its own because it deserves to be, or that ultimately the customer may benefit from it in that same, it's that contextual thing.
The joint venture may and its expression may take its own form that's most appropriate to that context.
Yeah, and you certainly wouldn't want to, from some arbitrary kind of user experience standpoint, hold it back from doing that.
Yeah, exactly. So then actually Kelvin, who is, I like to call him the godfather of conservation in Singapore. Actually then that's quite a good segue to Kelvin's question around the value of creating some kind of, as opposed to holding back, what is the value of creating or maintaining some kind of center in all systems to support a resilient system? So you kind of came from things at a decentralization perspective. I think Kelvin is kind of bringing us to what's the value of a bit of centralization. I think, or Kelvin, you can come off and and phrase your question as you wish.
Hi, Yishan. Thanks. Good to hear from everybody. I guess it's not so much centralization of systems or processes, but in a situation where everything's going to, as Suzanne says, extremes, right? And yet the way forward must be through some kind of compromise, even though we may not like the word, then this role of creating a platform for a center, but of an evolving center, whatever the issue is being debated, how important might that be? Because we've seen systems where there is no center, and then maybe in a sense the public service then gets stuck, and people fragment, and at the national level it can be quite disastrous. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. I mean, from an organization or from a social system. Thank you.
So, I have a thought. Kelvin, when I first saw your question, the immediate thing that came to my mind was what you said, right? That some systems don't have centers, at least not in a physical sense, right? The distributed system, if it is truly distributed, will literally be that, right? It will have no center. It will have multiple interacting parts that have moral and kind of interdependent effects on each other, but there will be no center. But I think what the center that I think is important, and you could use a different word, maybe think about it as like the soul, the core purpose of an organization. That kind of centering, I think, is critical. It's not about physical or structural centering, but a centering in terms of a common sense of what we're all setting out to do. Just as an example, my ministry at the moment, right, it's called the Ministry of Communications and Information, and we deal a huge amount of technology. But the nature of communications, the nature of information are changing, right, all the time. You don't need me to tell you that. But what's really interesting is we've all had to sit and ask ourselves, amidst all of this change, what centers us, right? What roots us in the work that we do? And we spent months actually having quite long discussions amongst our leadership and amongst the middle managers, and now we're taking it to our teams as well to ask ourselves, what is our purpose, right? What is that central purpose in our lives? Because if you kind of buy the Simon Sinek idea that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, then you've got to figure out that why, right? That purpose becomes key. So that kind of centering, I think, is critical. And things like vision statements, missions allow us, I think, to articulate that somewhat. But even those need to be articulated in a way that they allow for some amount of variation at the margin. Because the guys who do media relations and the ones who do public comms and campaigns in my ministry versus the ones who are thinking about digital access and literacy, or the ones who regulate our telcos, they all touch very different parts of the ecosystem, but they need to know what they have in common with the rest, I think. So that kind of centering, I actually think, is really quite critical. But it's much harder to do than a purely technical or structural type of process.
This is metaphor, I think, about. I've thought about this recently because I think in my mind I would think about like clear, crisp, kind of like hierarchical systems in some way, or this kind of distributed system like you're talking about. Think about all these nodes and what are the kind of what is almost the operating system that affords that, right? But I think what's recurred to me maybe over the last 2 or 3 years after reading Other Minds, this book about cephalopods and like the intelligence of cephalopods. It's amazing. It's an amazing book, which is really around how, like in an octopus or something, there's these clusters of nerves at the top of each arm that they're not quite brains, but they're this heavy density of nerves that have like local autonomy. And so like one arm of the octopus can kind of think and make decisions independently about grabbing food and things without control from the central brain. And they can operate completely independently without knowing what each other is doing. But then when needed and when necessary, the sort of master brain snaps in and they all respond and behave together. And there's something interesting to me about this idea of a system that does both and has kind of agreements within it about when it's in one mode and when it's in another.
I think that sounds actually like scenarios to me, which I will tag to Irvin's question, and please come off, Irvin. But I think Irvin's question, actually, to contextualize it a bit, Aaron set up the first Center for Strategic Futures in Singapore, and Singapore has had this practice of scenario planning for many years now. So yes, Irvin, maybe I'll let you do the honor of sharing your question. And it looks like everything is fine with you.
Yeah, great background.
Yes, surrounded by fire.
So good.
Everything
It's fine background, so it's all going well. And thanks so much for speaking. Really, really insightful. I was just taking down some notes earlier, and then and that was when I was reminded that yes, Aaron, I mean, you were at, I think, was it the Center for Strategic Futures for a while?
You were our best intern, right?
Oh gosh, no. That was good fun. And I mean, hearing what you've been talking about design just made me think, how has the discipline itself changed? Because would you be able to apply, that same framework about assumptions and blind spots to the entire field of design? Because I just presume it must have changed in the several decades that we've done this, whether in the Singapore Public Service or for as long as the discipline has been around. A bit meta, I guess.
So is your question about how futures has changed or about how design has changed, or both?
Well, how futures has changed, and I guess how so a person in the 1980s, I guess, answering the question, how do we design a resilient future, would probably approach it and answer it differently from how you're approaching it now. And I'm just wondering what would have changed between then and now.
Yeah. Well, okay, let me start with this, right? I'll say that, first of all, your question totally warms my heart, because one of my big little mantras when I was doing futures work was we were seated right next to kind of the innovation team in the public service division, right? What we call the PS21 office, public service for the 21st century. I think they've renamed themselves now. But what was fun about it was they did lots of design thinking. And we were doing all this future stuff, right? Futures wheels and scenario planning and many different methods. And I used to nag them and just stand in the kind of corridor between the two clusters of desks, right? And tell them, guys, design is futures applied to today, and futures is design applied to tomorrow. Wow. It's the same set of skills. We all use Post-its, right? Surely that should tell us something, right? And we all love marker pens of a particular kind. So I thought that was an important way to start, because I do really believe that they are fundamentally the same sets of human-oriented skills where we're trying to kind of unearth the deep assumptions of the systems that we're in. But to answer your question directly, right, I think for me, there's three ways in which the discipline has been evolving. One, it's moved from being almost a purely analytic process, right? Analysis of trends, looking at evidence, asking what kind of trajectories we're on, to a more immersive process, where I think now we realize that actually the best futures communicate, to use the phrase I said earlier, right, with the mind and the heart and the whole person, right? Not just with the cerebral aspects of someone. So the assumption that is being upended there, right, is that a person is only their mind. Right? We're learning now that people are whole, and we need to engage with the wholeness of their humanity, not just their analytic side. Second change is that I think it's moved from being an expert activity to a much more participatory activity. Any good future should always consult widely, but I think many years ago, you would have seen a situation where lots of experts would have been interviewed, the decision makers in an organization would have been interviewed, but you probably wouldn't have heard lots of questions being posed to the rest of the organization. Whereas I think today it's a lot more participatory. And I loved it, for instance, when the Institute of Policy Studies, one of our think tanks at the Lee Kuan Yew School, did a set of scenarios with citizens, right? They set up an exhibition at NLB, and they started asking people, what future do you want to see? And can you come and like sing rewritten National Day songs and go through this process of futuring with the folks at the think tank? So expert to participatory, and I think the assumption that we're letting go of there is that futures can be a hero-led exercise, right? We need everybody to be involved rather than have this process be moved by an elite few. And then the last thing that I think is changing is that a lot of futures, when I first started doing it, was very adaptive. It was about saying, here are the trends that are out there, and we must adapt to those trends. Whereas today, I'm seeing a lot more activist futures, right? Futures that says, what do I want to see, and how do I start creating that, or what do I not want to see, and how do I avoid those things? So I think the assumptions that are changing there are around agency, right? The adaptive model says that we don't have much agency, we just respond to the world. The activist model says we have the ability to shape at least some aspects of our futures and craft our own destinies. And I love that change is happening as well. Yeah.
Actually, just to welcome Dominic, my co-founder of EAT, who has just entered the room,
Hello,
also
Dom.
another busy man. I wanted to.
Hi,
Yes.
just saying a quick hi. I'll let you get back to it.
Hello. So I don't know if anybody in this group gathered still has questions, but I thought I would just lobby a closing one to you on that note, which is that what are assumptions about the future, which I believe is, and I think the pandemic has shown us, is inherently unknowable and ultimately unstable. What are some assumptions about the future that we must immediately question? But then perhaps also if there are some, speaking of activist futurists, then what are some assumptions about the future that we can hope, or you would hope remain true? And then we can close for the evening if no one else would like to chime in.
I'll start, Randy, if you want to think for a bit more. Yeah. So one of the things that I would love to see is that the assumption of exchange gets replaced by assumptions about gifting, which is why I said what I said earlier. For me, that's really quite critical. I don't think gifts can be the only economy out there, but if we can just complement exchange with a bit more of an understanding of what gifts are, I think we'd be better off for it. And there are lots of anthropologists who have written about this, right? Marcel Mauss has done a lot of work on it. Lewis Hyde has a great book called The Gift, where he kind of takes us through the
Incredible. Great.
And utterly transformative in how we can approach things. So that's one that I'd like to see. And then the other, right, is for us to stop assuming that time is this uniform kind of entity with homogeneous units in it. I'll tell you what I mean by it, right? I'm rapidly realizing that we all live in multiple clock speeds. Recovery from a pandemic occurs on a certain kind of time frame. Organizational change happens on a particular kind of time frame. Growth of a child, right? Gestation happens on a different kind of time frame. And economic success happens and might disappear in a particular kind of time frame. And I'd love for us to start loosening our assumptions on time being uniform and realizing that actually there are multiple ways of being out there. And just to use a cooking metaphor, because I'm starting to get hungry, right? There are some things you want to sear, and there are some things you want to grill, and then there are other things you want to sous vide, and that's okay, right? Because the sous vide stuff takes time, but it's pretty worthwhile by the end of it. And so, yeah, I'm thinking a lot about clock speeds at the moment and how we can learn to live in multiple clock speeds at the same time and not give in to this facile assumption that time is this uniform entity.
That's beautiful. Randy, chime in.
Yes. Okay, I think the assumption that I believe we should question, I think we already are, but is that that growth is both good and inevitable. I think that I would argue that the natural course of things is for them to come and go. But somehow we have this pursuit of trying to make things come and then continue to go and then come bigger. And I think that that's just the downstream implications of that as like the broadly accepted truth, I think creates a lot of unhealthy outcomes. The thing that I want to believe will stay, this is the other part of your question, right, that we kind of endure, is I think that I think it must stay because we're just at the beginning of it, but I think a more engaged and curious awareness of privilege and the impact of sort of almost multi-generational, I would say, multi-generational privilege and multi-generational pain, and the impact those have on our societies. The amount of kind of emergent awareness and interest in that, I think, is really, really encouraging. But it must continue. It's just, we're just at the tip of the iceberg, it seems. But I hope so, because to me that that. Facing that, I think, in a really authentic way is maybe one of the greatest sense of like hope I have. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I'm just thinking about how actually a lot of lockdown, circuit breaker, being at home, or even deprivation has forced people to rethink their models. I mean, even their spending, or at least for me, and also then forced us, given us a context through in which we can sit and look at some of these things. Actually, we have a question from Melissa. Yeah, which is referring to the conversation about learning. So Melissa, you're about to start a full 9-month learning exploration. It sounds like you're kind of curating your own sabbatical, and you love advice for this journey. So Melissa, do you want to share more about your question?
Hi, this is Melissa. Not really. It's only the beginning, so I'm not very clear on what's going to happen, but it is something that has been crafted with my managers. So it's not quite a sabbatical because I'm still part of the working community, but I will be learning new stuff and implementing and putting it into practice with my colleagues. And as a guinea pig, I'm also sort of inflicting my learning on them, and we're all learning in this together. But I thought it really spoke to what you mentioned before on how organizations should give more space to learning and growth. So that's something that I'm very lucky to be a recipient of. But so if there's any thoughts around that, we're literally just trying it out as we go along.
So just to clarify your question, it's how can as somebody going along this journey, you what advice you could what advice you'd have in terms of you creating space both for yourself to learn, but to take the rest of the organization along with you. Is it correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Oh, this is such a beautiful opportunity. Yeah. I mean, in a way, I feel like we were both describing versions of like, I wish this could happen. And here you are saying it. I feel it's a strange position to give like advice from, because I feel like you're in it. This is exactly right. But it's maybe about preserving or protecting it in a way, which I would maybe describe as like the interface for it, which is to frame it for others as good, help other people know that it is good, that it is unclear and fuzzy and flexible, that like it is intentional and by design that there's that space, and that in and of itself is the outcome, right? Yeah. To protect that and find the other maybe people who are the other advocates of it to help you protect it, and then when it's done, continue to protect it, right? It wasn't like, oh, what was this very specific like measurable outcome you got that achieved the thing? I'm sure that will become a question, and to be prepared to help people interface with it and see it as valuable in the same way that you've experienced it as valuable, not through their typical terms or something.
My thought, and I agree completely with Randy, by the way, I feel woefully unqualified to give you advice on this. But if you haven't already thought about it, right, I would document, like have a daily ritual where you do a little bit of documentation, whether it's in like a 500-word diary entry, or just 3 things you learned that day, or 2 things you were grateful for, something you hated. Have something that you document, because I think over the 9 months, you will find that you might want to go back and you'll have forgotten things if you don't name them. I mean, one of my friends' moms used to say to us, that the bluntest pencil is more useful than the sharpest memory, right? Because we all lose everything if we don't write it down. And so I think having some kind of safe space where you just chuck a stream of consciousness of what you are learning and what you're taking away and what you're frustrated by will over time, I think, show you some really interesting emergent patterns. And that will be really useful in convincing skeptics or the powers that be or decision makers that this is valuable. Because like I said with clock speeds, right? The clock speed of learning may not be in 2 weeks. You might find that even 9 months isn't right. Maybe a year and a half from now, you suddenly look back and be like, oh, that's why I did this. Right? And I think the more you document, the more you'll be able to go back to it. And how you do it doesn't matter, right? Diary, Google Doc, whatever. I don't think that matters. Or drawing pictures. But do something, because I think you will really treasure the documentation that you have.
Yeah, that sounds lovely. Yeah. Awesome. And also, since I'm actually seeing you in 18 days or so, Melissa, I'd love to continue to share the headspace around learning, and it sounds like 9 months is kind of also gestation for something quite awesome to come. And also thank you everybody for sharing this about an hour and a half with us. And we will be recording the session and putting it on video as well. And we just want to say thank you to Straits Clan and Celeste for hosting us in this lovely space.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, the Clan Cafe is open to public, so please do come and visit. We're at the edge of Kyungsik. And lastly, if you like what you've heard, do sign up for our mailing list at projectkeep.sg. We did our last session on a topic called Innovating Through Uncertainty, and that's available on YouTube as well. So which we'll also post on our mailing list when this recording of this session is out. But thank you so much for learning together as a community, and have a lovely rest of your week.
Thank you for bringing us
thank
together.
you,
Yes,
both
thank you.
gentlemen, for.
Thank you.
Shall continue.
We will.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Sean, Aaron, and Wendy. I know you guys are super hungry, so enjoy your evening. And I'll see you guys at the club, everyone else. Good night.
Bye, everyone.